Hey everybody, welcome to another How to Do It episode. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to set up and use the Revolution Arrow Saw from Last Chance Archery. Alright everybody, so when you take your Revolution Arrow Saw out of the box, almost the entire saw is already going to be assembled and ready to go. There's a couple parts that will not be. The water container and the water dripper will come inside the package separate from the saw. Inside this container, there's going to be two small plastic baggies, and inside those baggies are going to be your 5 brushes, your 3 mops, your deburring tool, and 1 small screw. So stay tuned and I will show you how to install these parts correctly, and then you'll be able to use your Revolution Arrow Saw. Alright, so now all you're going to do is you're going to take your water container with your water dripper, and it's already got Velcro installed onto the bottom side. This Velcro will stick directly to these Velcro pieces on top of the saw. You're just going to stick that in place, and then you're good to go. The next thing you want to do is you want to ensure that this rubber tube is inserted all the way in to this valve, because if you don't, as you pour water into your container, it could leak around that rubber tube, but as long as it's installed fully, you're not going to have that issue. So just check to be sure that rubber tube's installed. Then you'll take the dripper and it will be inserted into this single hole on the front side of the blade cover. There's only one place it can go, so that's very simple. You just pop it in place, and then at that point, you're good to go on this end of the saw. Then you'll open the packages with your brushes and your swabs, and they just screw right into place. So biggest to smallest, biggest to smallest, you're just going to screw each of these in place. You want to get them tight, because as you put your arrow shafts on these brushes and swabs, you don't want them to come loose, because sometimes the shafts can be tight. So you'll just tighten those down on both sides. Then you're going to take a 3/32 Allen wrench. You're going to take your deburring tool and your small screw, and the deburring tool goes all the way on this right side of the unit. Once you get that screw started, you're just going to go ahead and screw it all the way down as close as you can get it. Then you're going to take your Allen wrench and tighten it the rest of the way. Some will say you can put the deburring tool on first, and it's a lot easier to maneuver the Allen wrench and get it tightened down. But either way, just tighten this screw down, get the deburring tool tight, and you want the deburring tool facing you so that you can put your shaft on the deburring tool as you're working here on the Revolution Arrow Saw. Alright, so now that you've got everything installed, there's only a couple of steps left, and then you're going to be ready to use your Revolution Arrow Saw. So the next step, and I've already done it here, but what you want to do, you always want to have a wet vac shop vacuum hooked to your saw. This is going to suck up not only the water from the saw and the dripper, but also all that carbon dust that a vacuum normally sucks up is still going to be coming out. Just with our saw, the water from the dripper is going to dampen that carbon dust. So it's even more imperative now that you use a vacuum, and it uses any hose that's around 1.25, 1 1/4, which are what most of those smaller shop vacs, like the 2.5 gallons, that's normally what the size of that tube is. So you're just going to take your vacuum, you're going to attach it here inside the vacuum slot, and then what you'll do next, you're going to take some water and you're going to dump the water into the water container, and then at that point you are going to be ready to use your saw. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is we want to go over each feature of the Revolution Arrow Saw. That way you know what features it has, and you can truly build a world champion class arrow setup. Because with this saw, you can build the most precise, consistent, and accurate arrow setup on the market, bar none. So with this saw, not only will it cut arrows like any other saw, but it has a very high quality blade on the inside, and we also offer replacement blades because over time those blades are going to wear down as you cut more and more shafts. If you're cutting more aluminum versus carbon, the blade may wear down faster. So there's no set number of arrows that the blade's going to cut before it wears down, but it's in the hundreds of thousands, and you should be good to go for a long time with the blade that comes on your saw. But if it ever does wear down, we do offer replacements. So then you can adjust your tail point forward and back, and the way everything that we have with the saw is built into this track, all the tolerances are extremely tight. So that's one great feature about this saw. It's going to be very precise and very accurate. So once you get your distance set, you'll just lock this down simply by turning this handle a quarter of a turn. That's all it takes. It's not going to go forward or back at all. Then this saw has adjustments, so it has a shelf here, and then your tail end can both move forward and back in unison with each other. So as your blade wears down, you can adjust both the tail end and the point end of the saw forward and back to match each other. That way you're never cutting the shaft at an angle. So on top of that, you have your spinning disc, so you can check the straightness of the shaft. You can cut the shaft. You can, inside here, we have a sanding disc that spins in unison with the blade. So what you can do, you can lay your shaft on the arrow spinners here, and then what you'll do is you can slide the shaft into this hole here in front of the blade, and that's where the sanding disc is. So you can slide it in and just lightly touch it against that sanding disc, and that is going to be your squaring device. So you can do that with both ends of the shaft. You just lay them on, and you always want to get the spin disc on this side as close as you can to the motor. That way it's giving more support to this end of the arrow as you're trying to square it up. So you can do both ends of the shaft that way. And then you've got brushes, and you've got swabs, and you've got the deburring tool. So you can put the shaft on the brushes, rough it up a little bit, then you can clean it out on the swab and get that dust out. Then you can deburr the end, and then at that point, this end of the shaft is ready to go, or this end, either one. Some guys prefer to cut 1 inch off the back side of the shaft and then square it up to be sure it is square and true. And then they cut the front side to whatever length they need. You can do it either way. So one other cool feature, there's a broadhead tightening tool here on the saw that you can use for any broadhead on the market. The majority of all will fit right in there, and you can loosen or tighten those broadheads using that tool. One other great feature of our saw is a large 1 inch wide measuring tape that goes from the front side of the saw to the back. So whether you're setting your knock adjustment point, or whether you're taking a shaft that maybe you've already got set up and you need to cut another shaft to the same length, it gives you great markings to where you can hold this shaft up to the measuring tape and determine the length of it, or whether you're setting this knock in, you've got large lines and large markings on that tape to where it's easy to adjust and to see. The other function of our saw is the water container and the water dripper. So we added this to our saw to help reduce all of that messy and harmful carbon dust that comes out of any saw, and it gets all over your shop table, it gets all over your shop. I mean, it gets everywhere. Even with a vacuum attached, that carbon dust still goes all over the place. So by using this custom water dripper, it's dripping water onto the arrow and the blade at a custom speed that works in unison with our spinning blade. So all you would do, you would turn your vacuum on first always. That way the vacuum is sucking, and as you turn the water on, you're not going to make a mess on your table. So you turn your vacuum on, then you'll turn your valve on, be sure there's water in the container, and then it's going to drip water right onto the arrow shaft and the blade, so that as it spins, the water sucks up all that carbon dust and it sucks it out the vacuum. Now, there's never any way to fully eliminate carbon dust, its particles in the air, but this gives you a very noticeable difference from just using a vacuum versus using a water dripper on the saw. And then what you need to be sure of is that you clean your vacuum out Pretty regularly. I mean, depending upon how many shafts you cut will determine that. But what can happen as you get that carbon dust and water sitting in your vacuum, you don't want it to go stale and start stinking. So it's my recommendation once a month, go dump your vacuum out, clean it out real good, and then put it back. I'll put a recommendation into this video as to what vacuum we use. It can be plugged in or battery powered, and it's very quiet and it's very consistent, and it's been functioning well for us in this workbench that we carry to all of our events. So you want to be sure you put your saw and set it up in a safe location so that you can cut arrow shafts without the worry of anyone coming by, because as you cut shafts, you're doing just that, you're cutting something, and there's always the chance that one of those pieces that you cut off could hit the blade and then could pop over off to the side. So you just want to be sure you do it in a safe location, and we always recommend using safety glasses when you use the saw. And when I start doing sampling and testing here for you in the video, I'll have my safety glasses on. But it's always best to be as safe as possible, especially in archery, because you're using your eyes for everything. If something were to happen and a piece of carbon or anything were to come off and hit you in the eye, that could be very detrimental. So always wear safety glasses as you use the Revolution arrow saw. All right, so a couple more features about the saw that you might want to take note of. It's got 4 1-inch tall solid rubber feet on each corner, so that wherever you sit the saw, it's going to sit firmly, and you're going to be able to put it anywhere you need to. The other option is drilling holes in the base of the saw like we've done here and mounting the saw to your table. If it's going to be stationary, this might be the route you want to go. That way you don't have to worry about hitting the saw or pushing it or whatnot as you're working with it. We do that with this rolling workbench because we carry this rolling workbench with us to tournaments and events, so that if people are there and they need arrows made, or whether they're using our bow presses or whatnot, we have all of our tuning tools there in case of equipment emergencies. And if you're going to be attending any tournament soon, be sure to look us up, and if we're in attendance, come by. You can check out all the products, you can test them, and see what you think. But you need to be sure, if you drill holes in the base, that you don't drill any holes and put bolts in line with where your spin disc are going to move back and forth. Because if you put a bolt in the way, it may stop your spin disc from moving. So just be sure you put one bolt as close to the blade housing as you can, and you can put one bolt at the other far end, and that way you're not getting in the way of the tail end as it moves back and forth. One other great feature about the Revolution arrow saw that we added is this shelf here. So we added this shelf because with other saws, what you find is as you hold your arrow and you twist it to cut it, you sometimes push down on the shaft, which is going to flex the shaft downward. So when you put an arrow in our saw, you line it up and you put it here, this shelf is giving the shaft support, so that it's also helping to give you the squarest cut possible before you even go over to the squaring device. Because if you can get a very, very close to square shaft at the beginning, you have a better chance of the squaring device working correctly and you having a flush and very consistent and square shaft. So that new shelf is a great new add-on to this arrow saw that's not on any other saw on the market, just to help give you some support, so that as you push down on the shaft and you twist it to cut it, you're not flexing it downward. All right, so the next thing you want to do is you want to align your stop and your shelf with each other. So they each have 5 tick marks. So what those tick marks are for is as your blade wears out and gets smaller, the shelf will need to go further in. Because as that blade gets further and it wears down and the blade gets smaller, the shelf will have to go further in to allow the shaft to get to that smaller blade. So what you'll want to do, you'll want to pull your shelf all the way out away from the motor as far as possible, and you do that taking a 5/32 Allen wrench. You'll just loosen the 2 5/32 screws underneath here. You'll pull the shelf all the way out until the tick mark aligns with the edge of this front plate. and I'll do a close-up of that so you can see it. But then all you'll do is tighten down those 2 Allen wrench screws. And once those are tight and everything's in line on this end, you're going to go to this opposite end. You'll just loosen these 2 thumb screws and you'll align the same tick mark. So that would be the first tick mark towards the back side of the saw. You want it pulled all the way out. That way both ends match each other. And when you do this, the arrow's not going to be cut at an angle because both ends match. And as your blade wears out, you can slowly move both ends inward closer as that blade gets smaller. You just always want to be sure both ends are equal. So once you get this end aligned, you'll tighten the thumb screws down and then you're set to go in regards to the shelf and the stop. All right, one other thing to remember with the Revolution Arrow Saw, all of these pieces are built into this 80/20 track, and what happens is on the inside you've got the thumb screw that goes through your parts, but on the inside there's what we call a track nut that the thumb screw goes into that makes these parts tighten against the track. So when you loosen the thumb screws to move your parts, you just don't want to loosen the thumb screws too far or the thumb screw will come out of that track nut. If that happens, I'll show you how to fix that. So say you're moving this part and you loosen it too far and it comes off the nut. I can show you here, these nuts are right here on the outside of the piece and they can come off. So all you would do, pull the piece completely off. Any one of these pieces, they're all identical in how this functions. You would take the piece off and you always want to put the small lip that's on that nut away from the part. So what you'll do, you'll put that nut back on just enough to make it hold. You'll leave a space in between it. You don't want to tighten the nut down. So then you'll loosen the other side and then you'll just slide it back into place one at a time here and then you're good as new. You can move it back and forth and then tighten the thumb screws to lock it down. Same thing with these other pieces. They all have the same nut on the bottom. So you just want to be sure when you loosen these to move the parts, you just loosen the thumb screw just a half turn or even a quarter turn, just enough to allow the part to move back and forth. All right, so before you cut an arrow shaft in your Revolution Arrow Saw, one other thing we recommend doing is taking a shaft that's bad, that you don't need anymore. And what you're going to do, you're going to go ahead and square the end of it. The reason for this is to take your 120 grit squaring disc that's in here and just wearing down those rough edges so that your first good shaft doesn't get torn up on the edges or around the outside just because of how rough it is. But after you run that first arrow shaft through it, it's going to wear down those rough edges and that squaring disc is going to be ready to go. So you can do this simply by taking your spin testers, like you'll do anytime you're squaring the end of a shaft. This side of the spin testers you want as close to the motor as you can get. The closer to the motor that side is, the more support this end of the shaft's going to have, which is going to give you a more square shaft as you slide the shaft into the squaring device. So I'm going to go ahead and put my safety glasses on. I've moved this side as close as I can get it. You're going to put the shaft on the spin testers, turn the motor on, square the end, and that's all there is to it. All right, so at this point, you're now ready to cut your first arrow shaft in your Revolution Arrow Saw. At this point, everything should already be set up. The depth of your tail end and your shelf should already be set. You should have water in your container. Your water dripper should be connected. Your vacuum should be connected. And everything else is ready to go. You've fixed your squaring device so that you've worn down those rough edges just a little bit. Now you're ready to cut your first arrow shaft. So I've got a hunting Black Eagle Zombie Slayer here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and measure this shaft because this is a pre-cut shaft. So say you have another hunting shaft that you need to match exactly. All you're going to do, hold the shaft up to the built-in measuring tape here. This shaft is 29 inches long. So I'm going to take this fresh shaft here, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and set my stop to 29 inches and lock it down. And as you can see, this handle only takes 1/4 of a turn and your stop is completely locked in place. And one other thing to remember, always cut your vacuum on first. Cut your vacuum on first, then your blade, then your water. And then you're going to cut it off, cut your water off, then your blade, then your vacuum. You never want to run the water without the vacuum installed because the vacuum is what creates the suction to pull the water and the carbon dust out of the backside of the saw. So if you're running the water and the vacuum's off, some of that water may come out the front and then it's just going to sit here in the bottom of the saw and you don't want that. So just be sure you're always running your vacuum, and remember, just a quick note, remember to always clean out your vacuum about once a month to be sure that the water and the carbon dust that sits in your vacuum doesn't go stale and start stinking. So now that I've got the saw set, everything's ready to go, I'm going to turn on my vacuum here, I'm going to turn on my blade, and I'm going to turn on my water. And now I'm going to hold the tail in, I'm going to put the arrow into the saw, rotate it. Now I've got a fresh cut shaft, so I'll turn my water off, my blade off, and the vacuum off. So now that I've got this fresh cut shaft, the next thing that we want to do, and you don't have to run the vacuum to square the end, just because as you're squaring the end, there's barely any carbon dust going to come off of that. So what I do is I just turn the blade back on, and I'm going to put my arrow here on the spin testers, slide the arrow right up to that squaring device, and I'm going to go ahead and do the opposite end as well. And you just want it to just barely touch that squaring device because it's 120 grit squaring sanding disc. So when you slide that arrow shaft up, that motor's spinning, it's going to square it right up just by lightly touching that shaft to it. So now I can go ahead and check the straightness of this shaft. That shaft's straight. I can go ahead and use this brush to clean out the inside. A swab. I'll deburr the edges. I'm going to do that to both ends here. I'll deburr the edges of the opposite end. And now you've got another 29-inch hunting shaft ready to go, and you're ready to use your Revolution Arrow Saw just like this. All right, so I now have a tournament shaft. This shaft is full length, and I'm going to start from scratch, and I'm going to go ahead and cut this arrow. I'm going to square the ends, deburr it, and then clean it out with a brush and a swab. Now, a lot of guys prefer to take a 1/2 inch or an inch off of this tail end of the shaft, and they do that because when you cut this and then square it, you're 100% sure it's square. Sometimes from the factory, you may not get a shaft that's perfectly square on the tail end. And the tail end is where your knock and your bushing goes, so that is the most important and crucial end for being square. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this shaft. I'm going to start by cutting an inch off of the tail end. So the shaft is 32 inches long, so I'm going to set my stop on 31 inches. And that'll take my 1 inch, so I'm going to turn my vacuum on, my blade, my water. I'm going to hold the tail end with one finger, put the shaft in, rotate it, and a good clean cut. So I'm going to cut the water off, my blade, and then my vacuum. So now that I've got that done, I want this shaft to be 29 inches. So I'm going to set my stop to 29 inches. And I'm going to do the exact same thing again. Vacuum, blade, water. I'm going to hold the tail end of the shaft here. Now I'll rotate it. Good clean cut. I'm going to cut my water off and my vacuum. So now both ends of this shaft are ready to be squared. So you just turn your blade back on. But again, I'll remind you, this side of your spin testers needs to be as close to the blade as physically possible. That way you're supporting this end of the shaft. When that when the deburring tool hits it, you want it to be supported as much as possible. So I'm going to turn the blade back on, square one end, now all I'm going to do is clean the inside out with a brush. I'll twist that to rough it up. Then clean it with the swab that gets any loose carbon dust out. I'm going to deburr the edges, and now I'm going to do it to the opposite end. I'm going to brush it, swab it, deburr the ends. Now I have a 29-inch tournament shaft ready to go, and I was able to do it with the Revolution Arrow Saw, and I am able to create world-class arrow setups from scratch using this saw. The only other step left is just checking the straightness of your shaft, and everyone's got their preferred method of doing that, but you can use the arrow spin testers here on the Revolution Arrow Saw just to check to be sure your shaft's straight. That shaft looks good to go, and now you're ready to do the exact same thing. You can create world-class arrow setups just like the world champion archers all over the world, or the top bow hunters that are all over television. You can do that too. You can get you a Revolution Arrow Saw, and you're going to be able to set up the same world-class arrow setups. One other great feature of the Revolution Arrow Saw is having the ability to cut arrows that have been pre-fletched. Some arrow saws out there on the market will not allow you to do this because when you put the arrow into the saw and you rotate it to cut the shaft, the vanes hit. So this is one great feature about the Revolution Arrow Saw, is having this tail end that has adjustments so that no matter where your vanes are on the shaft, you can move the tail end, the holder portion of your stop, so that it doesn't hit the vane. So I'm going to show you how this works. The first thing you want to do is you want to remove the knock. And we always recommend removing the knock and using the bare shaft as your cutting point, because every knock is different. The throats of the knocks are going to be different depths depending upon what brand you use. So removing the knock is always the best option. Just sit the knock off to the side. So as you can see right now with the current setup, if I try to put the arrow into the stop, the vanes are hitting. So you can adjust that simply by taking your 1/8 inch Allen wrench, loosening this set screw, moving the holder back all the way against the stop, tightening that set screw back down. And now the arrow goes in flawlessly, the vanes don't hit, you can spin the shaft, and you can go ahead and cut that shaft that's already been pre-fletched. Alright, so now I'm going to show you how to change your blade and how to change your squaring disc. They're both on the inside of this motor housing, so I'm going to show you how to take it apart. I'm going to show you how to change the blade and how to get the new one on in the correct location. I'm going to show you how to change your squaring disc, and I'm also going to show you how to put this housing back on and in place in the correct location, because all of these parts need to be in the correct location so that your saw functions correctly. I'm going to bring the camera up. I'm going to do it really close so you can see all of the moves and so you can do it correctly. So stay with us and I'll show you how to change your blade and your squaring disc. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is remove your vacuum hose. Next, you're going to want to remove your water dripper. You're going to remove your water container. It just pops off just like so. And then you want to take a 5/32 Allen wrench and you're going to want to loosen these two screws here that are holding the shelf in place. You're just going to take those completely out one at a time. And then once they're out, set them off to the side. This is so that you can remove the shelf so that you'll then be able to remove the housing and then ultimately the blade. So you'll remove that second bolt there, and then you're going to remove the shelf, and then you're going to take a 3/32 Allen wrench and you're going to loosen these two screws that are straight in line with the arrow squaring disc on the inside, and they'll be pretty stiff. So just loosen one, loosen two. You're going to take those out until the housing is loose. Then you'll sit the housing off to the side. Now while you've got this off, you can go ahead and clean the inside of the housing and get all that carbon dust and whatnot out. Alright, Now that you have your cover off the blade, and now that your chuck is exposed and your blade's exposed, you're just going to take 2 Allen wrenches, smaller Allen wrenches, that will fit inside the hole in the front chuck and the back chuck. So you're just going to put that Allen wrench there, take 1 Allen wrench and put here, and you're just going to pop these 2 loose. So you're going to turn the front one to the left until it's loose, and then you're going to go ahead and take it off. Put that chuck off to the side. Now your blade's exposed and ready to be removed. Just slide the blade off, sit it off to the side, take your new blade, and you're ready to put it on. Slide it in place. And I've actually got a new chuck here that I'm going to put on just so I can show you how to put the sanding disc in place. You'll take that chuck, tighten it down. Take your 2 Allen wrenches, same principle applies, just in the opposite direction. Tighten the front chuck, and you'll cinch that down really tight. Once that's done, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to clean the front side of this, because you want this sanding disc, the adhesive, to stick really well. So I've actually got some LCA activator. You're going to spray that. Clean it off with like a microfiber, any type of towel really. Then you're going to take the sanding disc, peel the adhesive backing off. And it's a strong adhesive, so it might take a second to get that backing off. You'll take the sanding disc, even it up, stick it to the device, to the chuck, stick it in place, press it really good. Just be sure that adhesive has stuck really well. Push that sanding disc up against the chuck. Now we're good to go there. And then what you're going to want to do, you're going to take the housing, and your screws will still be installed, and if not, you can put them right back in place here. And then you're going to take your 3/32 Allen wrench, and what you're going to need to do is line up both of these screws with the holes in the plate that's behind the blade. So there's 2 holes here. So what you need to do is align those screws one at a time, and then what you're going to want to do is align the top cutout of this housing here with the top cutout portion of your plate. So you'll line those 2 surfaces up, and once those surfaces are in line, you're going to go ahead and cinch these screws down one at a time. And they'll kind of cinch themselves down in the correct location. You don't want to over tighten them, but you do want them to be tight enough so that they're not going to go anywhere. So you can see that housing is tight. And now the next step is going to be installing your shelf. So you'll take the shelf. Everything else is already in place, all of your screws and everything. So you're going to take your shelf and your 5/32 Allen wrench and your 2 screws. You're going to install the shelf here. The shelf will go over the blade. You'll align it with that first mark as we talked about earlier in the video, and then you're going to take the screw, and you can do either one of them first. Go ahead and just get that screw started. Screw it in slowly. Then you'll take your other screw. You'll line it up with the second hole here, and you'll just screw it in, and you can go ahead, line the shelf up with that first notch, with that first tick line. Tighten your second screw completely. That cinches the shelf in place, and it's in line with the opposite end, and now you're ready to put your accessories back on. So now what you're going to go ahead and do, hook your vacuum tube back to the saw. You're going to install your water container just like you did at the beginning, and then you'll take your water dripper and you're going to install it back into the front side of your housing. Now you have a new blade, you have a new sanding disc on the inside, everything's back to normal, and you're ready to go. All right, everybody, that's about it. Thank you for joining us for another How to Do It episode. You're now ready to use your Revolution Aero Saw. We hope that you enjoy it. If you ever have any questions, you can visit our website, you can send us a contact form, you can email us, you can call us. We'd be more than happy to help answer any and all of your questions. You can purchase from us, from dealers. You can find all of our authorized distributors on the Last Chance Archery website. And you can also find more how to do it videos that cover tuning tools, tips, techniques. And we hope to continue to build that archive with more and more videos that can help you better your tuning and shooting abilities. So again, if you have any other questions, contact us directly. We'd be happy to help. We hope you have a great day, and thank you for joining us.